Good morning and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for community and faith partners. Today's program is Clearing Death Row, the push for universal clemency under Gavin Newsom. Thank you. The important and ongoing work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council would not be possible without generous funding from congregations, corporations, faith-based social service agencies, foundations, judicatories, and supporters like you. Help us spread the word. Visit sfinterfaithcouncil.org to learn about SFIC programming and how to become a supporter. Follow SFIC on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to SFIC's YouTube channel to watch all of our virtual events. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. For chat, you may submit a question or comment by selecting the chat button at the bottom of your screen and then send a message to Q&A. Questions will be forwarded to the host and answered time permitting. For closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this special online briefing for community and faith partners. When Governor Gavin Newsom took office, he placed a moratorium on executions in California, marking a bold stand against the death penalty. Now, with just 18 months remaining in his term, a powerful coalition of faith leaders, civil rights advocates, and legal experts is urging him to take the next historic step, granting universal clemency to all individuals on death row. We welcome you to this timely and urgent conversation on the moral, legal, and human rights case for clearing California's death row. This presentation will explore the legacy and impact of universal clemency grants, walk through the clemency process in our state, and make the case for why the time to act is now. Together, we can shape a more just and compassionate California. As we do at the beginning of each of these programs and all convenings of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, allow me to read the Interfaith statement. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we're invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. As we do at the beginning of each of these programs, we invite a faith leader to ground us in a reflective moment. And we are very intentional about picking these particular faith leaders because they, in most cases, if not all, have a passion about the subject being discussed for the day. Today is no exception, and it is wonderful to welcome back our immediate past chair, Reverend Vanessa Rush Southern, the senior minister at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco. It is wonderful, wonderful to see you, Vanessa. And I know this has been it's been quite the week, and so we're looking to you for some solace and also some inspiration and some hope.
Well, part of the solace and hope is being together with other people who are continuing to ask the biggest and most important questions of our day and then lean into them with our lives. So thank you for asking me to be a part of this morning. It's a huge honor. Years ago, when my spouse was starting graduate school and I was unemployed for a brief period of time, I found myself in Philadelphia, and I decided it was time for me to do some work for a cause that I had always been really clear in my support of, but never done much to help progress practically. So I went to the American Friends Service Committee headquarters, the Quaker headquarters, and I asked the woman in charge of leading their effort to abolish the death penalty work what I could do to help her. And I'm really proud of the work that I was able to do, the little bit, and what I learned and what it launched me into. And I will say too that I'm really proud now to be in a church, First Unitarian Universalist Church of San Francisco, where Robert Bacon is a member, who is one of the many people like Elizabeth, who has been working to defend those on death row and work to end the death penalty for decades. I asked Bob, I thought I'd share with you all that I asked Bob once what he would do if California completely abolished the death penalty. And he said, deadpan and with all quiet seriousness, I would retire, which is to say that he continues to go to work every day only because there is still this moral sword of Damocles over our collective heads. And I'm grateful for everybody who does that work continually. It's always been so obvious to me that abolishing the death penalty was one of those clear moral issues. And I say that, and I think it's important to say that, although it's a little odd maybe to admit, that I've also always been clear that I'm not 100% sure I wouldn't be capable of violence or vengeance if someone that I loved was hurt or killed. I think it's one of the places that I wrestle with in my own heart, a place where I know or worry that what I might do is in tension with the wisest teachings I know and believe in. And I say that because I think when we're looking at the death penalty work, we have to be honest about what's in the human heart and how we hold that in relationship to our choices and moving forward together. So even though there is spiritual uncertainty in my own heart, I've always been really clear, as many of us have, that as a nation, we don't want to make it legal or common, this practice of taking another life. I think we all know all of the statistics about the cost of a death penalty case versus the cost of incarceration, that utilitarian argument. I think we all have heard about the chances of being wrong and how high they are and know the horrors of that. But what moves me, I wanted to share this morning, what moves me in this call for our collective lives to hold this highest standard is this fear that we ever lean into conforming to the lowest standard, moral standard together. My minister growing up used to say, choose your enemies carefully, or you shall become like them. Choose your enemies carefully, for you shall become like them. To me, when I think about us as a nation training and paying people to do a version of what the people we want to punish did that we find so reprehensible, that to me is one of those moral moments where we need to be really clear that there's no pretending about the soul scarring horror of being a nation that assents to or conforms to the worst of what we individually might be capable of. Because then when we do that, I fear the slippery slope is greased and everything that we love is in danger of sliding from view, particularly when it's about the dignity and worth of human life. And this week, that feels very real. The need to protect the sacrality of human life, the holiness, to not descend to the lowest common denominator of our shared values or even instincts, that we as a nation, and this is my prayer for us this morning, O God of the many names by which we know you, who is beyond all naming, please help us to be greater together than the worst of any of our instincts. Please help us to shape our collective lives in this issue and in all issues in this day and in all days toward the best in us, the holiest in us, so that we might shape a nation that helps us draw the heaven of our dreams, the beloved community of our highest aspirations, down to take root on this earth that we make and shape and live in and are shaped by together. So may it be. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And thank you for your passion and for your heart. Today is going to be a unique opportunity for us to become educated, because you will have an opportunity when this recording link is sent out to sign on to a letter if you would like, if you so would like, to urge the governor to do something. And we will get into that later. I also, before introducing our featured presenter today, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Matthew Shilvach, who is the Tad and Diane Toby General Director of the San Francisco Opera, who is with us today. Part of this production today is also an acknowledgement that in September will be the 25th anniversary of a specially commissioned opera called Dead Man Walking that features Sister Helen Prejean. It is it is deeply a faith-based opera, if you will. And one of the great things about San Francisco and unique things about San Francisco is our cross-sector partnerships. And I just want to acknowledge Matthew because he has been a great partner for decades now. And we are very grateful to him and to the opera for the opportunities he has given us and to support some of the good works at the opera. And now we begin. Elizabeth Semmel, that's a name that sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? In the spirit of full disclosure, this is Rita Semmel's daughter, okay? And Rita is very proud of her daughter, and rightfully so. Liz is the Chancellor's Clinical Professor of Law and co-director of the Death Penalty Clinic at UC Berkeley Law. She joined Berkeley Law faculty in 2001 after 2 decades as a criminal and capital defense attorney and 4 years as director of the American Bar Association Death Penalty Representation Project in Washington, D.C., including several years as adjunct faculty, Georgetown Law. Liz was the founding director of the Death Penalty Clinic, which she currently co-directs. In that role, she represents clients facing capital punishment at all stages of the proceedings in California and several states in the South. Liz and her students have filed amicus curiae briefs in death penalty cases before the Supreme Court. And I won't go into all of them, but I will say as a caveat here, Professor Semmel will be speaking in her personal capacity and not as a representative of the university or the law school. That said, Liz, we are honored to have you here today. You honor your mother by coming to the Interfaith Council, but also helping us to understand this very complicated issue. And hopefully you'll be able to shed some light on it. So we welcome you with open arms and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I too am honored to be here. In my alternate identity as Rita Semmel's daughter, an identity I am very pleased to have. I want to say that I'm extraordinarily grateful to Vanessa for her words, because as I was thinking about what I would say to you all today, I thought that it would be utterly presumptuous of me to speak to you all about the moral arguments against capital punishment, about mercy and redemption, the value of human life. And so to be able to follow someone who spoke so eloquently about it, and now to speak to you in more pragmatic and political and legal terms about universal clemency, I feel like I'm a little more in my lane. I also want to thank Bob Bacon, who I notice is with us and has been played such an instrumental role, not only as Vanessa said, as such a dedicated and skilled Capitol defense lawyer, but has had an enormous role in the abolition movement in this state and also in some of the fundamentals of making sure that I would be properly prepared to speak with you this morning. So I'm going to start by talking, and can I have the first slide? I'm going to start by talking about the clemency power, what it means generally, historically, and then specifically what it means in California. It is a power that is given to the executive branch to reduce or set aside criminal penalties imposed by courts. And it can be effectuated in one of two ways: by what we call commutation, which means that the individual's conviction remains, but the penalty is reduced. And what we're talking about here, as we get into it further, is the commutation of the death sentence and the imposition of a penalty, the only alternate penalty in the state of California currently, of life without possibility of parole. And let me just put an asterisk on life without possibility of parole, because I'm sure that some of you watching now and later have questions about that punishment as it concerns issues of human rights. But as a legal matter, that is the alternate punishment that we have in California. I think most recently, when people think about clemency in connection with commutation, they likely think about President Biden's act of clemency, in which he commuted the death sentences of 37 of the 40 people on federal death row in December of 2024. The executive also has the power to pardon. And some of, if I'm not being too political, some of the recent pardons of our now president have been in the news of late. But when we think about a pardon, we are talking about the elimination of the conviction. And when we talk about universal clemency in California, we are not talking about pardons. Again, we are talking about commutations. So the power that an executive has applies to both capital and non-capital cases. It applies across the board to criminal cases. And again, we usually think about it in the case of the individual, that a governor or president will commute the sentence of an individual for particular reasons. This is a power that goes back to the British kings. It's known as a power that was exercised by divine rights. And then later, as the United States became the nation it is, it was assigned by the federal constitution and state constitutions to the presidents. And it's a power most governors have. Typically, it's the governor's executive power. In a few states, it's a power held by a board. When we think about what are the justifications for clemency, again, it is considered a divine right in the sense that it is not reviewable by a court. But in most instances, it's justified as a fail-safe for things that went wrong in the justice system. So a grievous wrong that the courts either couldn't, because of lack of jurisdiction, which means essentially the court didn't have the power over the case, or wouldn't correct. Most typically, it will have to do with a situation. I'll give you a couple of examples historically that are fairly common in the death penalty context. A doubt about whether the individual is factually innocent of the crime, but that was not corrected by a court, and a governor steps in and doesn't feel that execution in those circumstances is justifiable. Or before the days in the United States when it was unconstitutional to execute juveniles, that is, individuals under the age of 18, in some states, governors would exercise clemency and commute the sentences of youth who were under the age of 18. The other way in which we think of clemency, and really more historically so, is an act of mercy or grace that has nothing to do with the crime itself, but is seen as acknowledging redemption, acknowledging growth and change on the part of the individual on death row. And something we may want to talk about more in the Q&A is what happens to these men and women, many of whom are on death row for decades, for 20 years, for 30 years, sometimes for 40 years, as they go from their youth, often in their 20s, most often in their 20s, at the age of the crime to much older, and the transformation that happens to those individuals over time. So the acknowledgement by the executive that the person who committed the crime decades ago is not the person who today is facing execution. So if I could have the next slide. This is a slide that essentially explains what do we mean by universal clemency. And universal clemency means the commutation of every death sentence in the jurisdiction. The death sentences under the jurisdiction of President Biden were all of those on federal death row. And obviously the jurisdiction of Governor Newsom is those on death row in the state of California. Universal clemency as a matter of an act by a state governor is not an unknown by any means. Some of you may be old enough to remember in 1986 when Tony Anaya, then the governor of New Mexico, commuted the sentences of everyone on death row there. In 2003, as I recall, it was Governor Ryan in Illinois, state that had a very large death row. He commuted all of those sentences in the face of revelations about a very large number of wrongfully convicted people on Illinois' death row. And then after Illinois repealed its death sentence, then Governor Quinn, this was in 2011, commuted the sentences of those people who couldn't be impacted by that repeal. In other words, when the state abolishes the death penalty, it affects those people who may in the future would have been eligible to be convicted of a capital crime. But what happens to those who remain on death row? Governor Quinn commuted those sentences. Governor O'Malley did the same thing in Maryland when Maryland ended the death penalty. And also, we saw a similar thing happen in the state of Oregon, the state of Massachusetts, etc. So sometimes it happens because repeal has occurred. Sometimes, take the case of President Biden, it's because repeal is not possible in the moment. In other words, Congress was not going to repeal the federal death penalty, and President Biden took the action that he felt he was compelled to take. So if I could have the third slide. The third slide is the statement of Oregon Governor Kate Brown after Oregon repealed the death penalty. Governor Brown commuted the sentences of those 17 people who remained on death row. And Governor Brown, this is, her whole statement, but I highlighted a few of her words because I think you'll see some symmetry between what Governor Brown said then and what our Governor Newsom said at the time he declared a moratorium in California. And she used words that some of which will be very familiar to you. She described the death penalty as immoral and irreversible, which goes back to this notion of those who have redeemed themselves, of those who may be factually innocent, of those whose legal wrongful conviction is not acknowledged by the courts. So not allowing for correction, wasteful of taxpayer dollars, some of the more pragmatic issues I want to talk with you about, does not make our community safer. Here she's referring to what we know statistically, empirically over decades of research, that the death penalty doesn't deter, that those states that have the death penalty are no safer than the states that do not. And then the very, very important notion that the death penalty cannot and never has been administered fairly and equitably. So those were the hallmarks of her decision to commute those sentences. So if I can have the next slide.
Let's keep the slide because I think we went ahead one.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so if you can go back, there we go. Great.
There we go. Great. So this is a slide about why the governor should grant universal clemency in California. And these are the reasons that the clemency campaign, the universal clemency campaign, is calling on the governor to take this action before he leaves office, which is that the governor knows the death penalty is inhumane, dysfunctional, racially biased, and error prone. I'm going to talk in give you some details about what that means. And so here we are not talking about the individual case. We're talking about system-wide injustice, ineffectiveness, and problems that are simply not within the capacity of us as human beings to fix. So if we go back, and if I could now have the next slide, and take a look at what Governor Newsom said in 2019 when he issued the executive order that placed a moratorium on executions. These are excerpts of the words he used then. He described the death penalty as unfair, unjust, wasteful, and protracted, which means that it takes an enormous amount of time for this process to come to an end. And I'm happy to discuss, if you have questions about why is that so, and why is it necessarily so that it is so time consuming and that it does not make us safer. He went on to talk about the uneven and unfair application of the death penalty, about the likelihood that 1 in 25 of the men and women on death row is innocent, and the cost. Then in 2019, $5 billion that had been expended on the death penalty since it was reinstated in 1977. And so the point I'm making here about these two slides is that everything that Governor Newsom said in 2019, when he decided, as he said, that no executions would take place under his watch, is consistent with the ask that is being made of him now, consistent with the values he expressed, consistent with the facts that he knows to be true. And so essentially what we're doing is saying that it's time for the governor to take the next step in the action he effectuated in 2019. So if I can have the next slide. I want to talk now just about some basic information about who is on California's death row. There are about 570 people on California's death row, which I'm not sure, I can't see your reactions, but often to non-lawyers and to lawyers who don't practice in the area in which Bob and I do, comes as an enormous shock that we have so many people. We are by far the largest death row in the United States, and we are one of the largest in the world. 2/3 of the people on death row in California have been there for more than 20 years. As I said, we can talk if you are interested in why that is so. A number that, at least to me as an attorney, is particularly compelling is that more than half of the men and women on death row do not have lawyers for their state habeas review. What do I mean by that? A death penalty case, after an individual is convicted and sentenced to death, goes through several stages of review. First, there is a direct appeal, and individuals across the country are guaranteed an attorney for that review. That's review based on the record in the case. The next review, which I would argue is the most important review that any individual can ever have, is what we call post-conviction or habeas review. The reason it is so critical, it is so indispensable, is this is the first and only time attorneys can go outside of that trial record to investigate for things that went wrong. It may be something, if we talk about innocence, an alibi that was never investigated. It may be new scientific evidence that was not unearthed, maybe errors in the scientific evidence that would have otherwise showed the individual was innocent of the crime. It may be, and more often is, sadly, revelations that the lawyers didn't do what their legal and professional responsibility required, which is to fully investigate the case and to present to the jury all of the facts and circumstances that would cause the jury to be merciful and vote for a life sentence. But all of that evidence that was never presented, that's when that evidence is gathered and presented to the court. So if half of those individuals don't have lawyers, and there is no funding for those lawyers, and there are no lawyers available to them, one of the major reasons why they are sitting there for as long as they are is that lack of representation, which in California is guaranteed to them by statute. So if I can have the next slide. This is where we get into the issue, to me, perhaps the most important issue of the unequal and discriminatory application of the death penalty. We know what the population of people of color in California are. We know that the African American population of people of color in the state of California is about 8%. Almost 70% of those on death row are people of color. 1/3 are Black men and women. Almost 50% are there for crimes they committed when they were under the age of 26. Why is that so important? Well, I could talk to you for a moment about the science, what some of you, I'm sure, have been exposed to, which is scientific developments that caused the United States Supreme Court now, 2 decades ago, to decide that individuals under the age of 18 were not fully formed adults, and therefore their culpability was less from a moral and legal perspective than those over 18. We now know that we are not fully formed adults in terms of our brain development, and therefore how we behave and act is not matured until we reach at least the age of 25. So when we think of those 50%, that's the time in which they committed their crime. I like to say that all I have to do is think about myself before the age of 26, and it's not difficult to imagine the difference in the human being I was and the individual I've become. And about 1 in 6, as I said, were under the age of 21. And then 1/3 of them have been diagnosed with serious mental illness. Several states now have a preclusion against the death penalty for individuals with serious mental illness. California is not one of those states. We do preclude the death penalty for individuals with intellectual disability, but not serious mental illness. So if I can have the next slide, hopefully that gives you a bit of context. Who are we talking about when we talk about the individuals on California's death row? Let me dig in a bit more to the issue of racial bias. A number of months ago, about 6 months ago now, the death penalty clinic filed a friend of the court brief known by lawyers as an amicus curiae brief in a case I want to talk a bit about that looked at the history of the state of California through the lens of race. And we have done that actually in a couple of cases, filed those briefs, bringing that history, which I suspect many of you know, to the attention of the court. Often when we talk about the death penalty historically, we think about the southern states. We think about the roots of slavery. We think about the legacy of slavery, and we think about the prevalence of the death penalty and the prevalence of executions in the southern states. And we like to think of ourselves in the North, and especially in the enlightened state of California, as different. But historically, we are not different. And as the data tells us, we were not different, and we are not different today when it comes to the insidious and pervasive influence of race. And we see discrimination in the way in which the death penalty was carried out before we were a state, after we became a state, before the United States Supreme Court in 1972 declared the death penalty unconstitutional, as did the state of California, and after the death penalty was reinstated in the late 70s. That thread of discrimination is a constant. Now, there is a case pending before the California Supreme Court now that challenges that discrimination under our state's equal protection clause, under our state's equal protection guarantee. And it shows empirically, statistically, that Black defendants are up to more than 8 times more likely to be sentenced to death in our state. That Latinx defendants are more than 6 times more likely to be sentenced to death in our state. And the defendants of all races are more than 8 times more likely to be sentenced to death when at least one of the victims was white. This data sets us apart, I would say, from a number of other states in the sense that the numbers are worse, they're more egregious. But it makes us part of the national picture in the sense that these disparities are very much consistent with what we see elsewhere. And as I mentioned, the Death Penalty Clinic and a number of other organizations filed briefs in the California Supreme Court trying to bring all of these issues and arguments together to urge the court to be the independent state that we can be, to, as Vanessa was saying, to lean into, to rely on our state constitution to set a higher bar for the kind of protections that we afford the individuals who reside in the state of California, commit crimes in the state of California, are here under the protection of the laws of our state. If I can have the next slide. Another issue that, Governor Newsom mentioned, and that again is a thread that sadly runs through capital punishment in the United States and in California, is the execution of innocent people. Sugar Graham, who's depicted here, is one of 8 innocent people exonerated from California's death row. Recently, DNA testing in the case of Kenneth Clare, who I believe was sentenced to death in Sacramento, strongly suggests and indeed may result in his exoneration. He has been on death row for more than 40 years after being sentenced to death. Originally, he's now serving a sentence of life without parole. But when I mention those hundreds of people who have not had an opportunity for habeas review of their cases, it would be through that review that has not happened for them, that the kind of evidence that is now coming forth in the Kenneth Clare case, or that in the Sugar Graham case came forward, that's the vehicle for bringing that to the attention of the court. So that means that we have, any number of people, whether it's 1 out of 25 or arguably more, on our death row who are factually innocent, whose cases have not seen the light of day. So if I could have the next slide, I'd like to talk a bit about money. Now, for people of faith, I recognize that the issue of cost is not the compelling issue that it may be for those who are not people of faith, but it is a critical issue in the state of California. And I would suspect for people in your congregations who may think about crime and punishment and how our criminal legal system functions in terms of where do we spend our dollars and what do we want to spend our dollars on. We have executed 13 people in the state of California since 1977. For the most time, we've had no executions in California. I should mention, I can't remember now if it's in another slide, but we've had no executions in California for almost 20 years. But 13 people in California at the cost of more than $5 billion. Recently, in a case, the National Conference of Chief Justices told the United States Supreme Court, a case that is now pending review by the United States Supreme Court, that for the state of California to afford lawyers in those habeas cases I was referring to a minute ago would cost more than $600 million. Essentially, the Chief Justice of the state of California and the other justices are explaining the delay in providing lawyers as reasonable because we don't have this money. So a question it certainly raises for me, and I think it might raise for you and your congregants, is this where we want to spend the money that we have so little of, asterisk to the state's enormous deficit, asterisk to the fears we all have about federal funding for critical programs, given the state of the federal administration. So this has got to be an issue for the governor, and it's got to be a compelling one. So if I could have the next slide. I want to mention, I believe this may be the last thing I want to mention, but it is certainly not the least important. It's something that Vanessa mentioned as well, which is the views of people who are the survivors in cases where someone they love has been killed, often brutally, often more than one person. The slide here gives you the thoughts of Bethany Webb, who is the daughter and sister of a victim of the Seal Beach mass shooting. She expresses the view that many people who are survivors express, which is in opposition to capital punishment, as something that doesn't bring healing, that doesn't bring closure, that doesn't bring peace. If I could have the next slide. And she goes on to talk about positive things that can be done to help support and heal and answer and address the grief that survivors experience. But we know, and Vanessa spoke of this, I think, very poignantly, that when we experience this kind of horror, our better selves are not always present with us, that it's often a struggle to find our better selves in those moments. But importantly, that isn't the decision maker. In other words, we don't let victims decide what should happen. We let our government decide what should happen. We let democracy decide what should happen. And in this instance, we let the chief executive decide whether all of the considerations that I've been speaking about merit support a decision to commute the sentences of everyone on death row. So if I could have the next slide. This brings me to the point of this presentation, which is an opportunity for each of you individually, for your congregations, for your organizations, to join in this effort to urge the governor to grant universal clemency by signing on. There's a link below. The Interfaith Council will be sending out follow-up information with a way in which you can join. And by joining, thousands of people on the steps of the Capitol on June 26 to urge Governor Newsom to take this critical step before he leaves office. He has, as I recall, about 18 months. Time in some ways may be shorter than we think, and it's certainly not too soon to begin this critical and urgent push for a humane end to what has been a horrific many decades of punitive and wasteful sentence in the state of California. So I thank you all for the opportunity to be with you. And if you have questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them.
Thank you, Liz. Over the last 18 years, we have been in many settings, but I've never heard you do what you do and profess. And this was so helpful. And Vanessa, your words were the perfect complement, as Liz mentioned at the outset. We do have some questions, and I'm going to pose them if that's okay. And we would encourage, if there's anybody online that has a question, to please send them to Q&A so that we can ask them in a timely manner. The first one is, are there ways in which people of faith can be uniquely effective in the campaign to persuade the governor to grant universal clemency?
I believe so. I probably touched on it. I think that Vanessa touched on it more than I did, which is there is this moral question. And that I can speak as a lawyer about the pragmatic, the political, and the legal. There is also, we have the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution that talks about cruel and unusual punishment, that has a uniquely moral dimension to it. It is certainly consonant with the Constitution to talk about morality. But when it comes to executive clemency, this is an act of grace. And I cannot think about a community more able to speak with eloquence and passion and deep feeling about what an act of grace means than the community, the faith community. I can't think about a community more able to talk about what transformation means in the lives of the men and women who've been incarcerated for decades, who are not who they once were, and who have always been more than the worst thing they ever did. and that the governor of all people should not define them so, and that we as a nation do not want to define them so. Just as we do not want to define someone who enters the United States unlawfully as only an illegal alien, to use the pejorative. And I don't want to equate the two by any stretch. Obviously, someone who's taken a human life sits in a different moral position than someone who's unlawfully entered the United States. But there is this same idea of labeling, of othering, of denying the humanity of individuals that I think we find has become, unfortunately, rather popular. And I can't think of any group better than the faith community to speak to the issue of the humanity of the individuals that can be acknowledged by this act of grace that the governor can exercise if he chooses to grant universal clemency.
I would go one step further and say that, those of us from San Francisco who know him, in his last two inaugurals, he has asked us to coordinate a service with faith leaders all over the state to pray for him. And he has an Office of Community Partnerships. And one aspect of that is to engage the insights of faith leaders. And so I think that there is a sincerity where he will listen. And I think that exercising that prophetic voice is going to be very, very important right now. The next question is, if the governor commutes all the death sentences to life without parole, what happens to the defendants who have evidence of innocence or evidence of significant unfairness in the trials where they were found guilty, for example, racially biased selection of the jury, or arguments that because of their individual circumstances, they are good candidates for parole, so they should have an opportunity to apply for parole?
So I think we need to we need to think about answering this question in two ways. One is access to the courts through by being represented by lawyers who can pursue those legal claims. This is a difficult question because presently individuals who are sentenced to death in California have a right to counsel, as I said, because we have a state statute that gives them that guarantee. We don't have the same statutory right for individuals sentenced to life without parole. And one of the things that we are going to need to work on, I think we need to work on it whether we get universal clemency or not, is assuring that kind of representation. Now, if you're watching or listening, the first place you may go, but won't that cost a lot of money? It will cost some money, but I want to emphasize that there is an astronomical difference between representing people in those cases and death penalty cases. And without getting into the details, death penalty cases are legally much more complicated, and they involve the question of punishment. In most capital cases, the central question is the imposition of the death penalty. The most costly issue to investigate and to litigate is the imposition of the death penalty. When we remove that from the equation and we're talking about whether or not the conviction was wrongful legally for any number of reasons, as you just said, Michael, that representation becomes much more manageable financially and in every other way. So I think it is definitely something we have to address, as I would argue we have to address. And actually, that's a good segue to the issue of what do we do with people who've been sentenced to life without parole, who may not have these legal claims, but may be suitable for parole because of the length of time they've been incarcerated, the progress they've made during their incarceration, etc. Currently, eligibility for these programs, if individuals have been sentenced to life without parole, is limited. It is precluded for people sentenced to death, or at least arguably so. That's a question the courts are going to have to wrangle with. But one thing that we have seen in the California legislature over the last decade has been an increasing recognition that has been codified in a series of statutes that have made parole more and more available, particularly for individuals under the age of 25 or 26, and increasingly for individuals sentenced to very long sentences. So I think that we are on a trajectory where we will see, if we have the legislature we've had, greater opportunity for individuals who've been sentenced to life without parole to have access to parole eligibility.
Thank you. The next question is coming from your former rabbi, Jonathan Singer. Recently retired, but I remember when he came here, this particular issue he was the champion of. So I'm glad he's asking this question because I was thinking it, and I know that you will answer sagely. Rabbi Singer asks, how much risk does Governor Newsom take as he tries to step on the national stage if he makes this decision? How do we support him if he does so?
I think this is a question for someone who is a political consultant and not a capital defense lawyer. It's hard to imagine that the question is not somewhere in Governor Newsom's brain, and is probably very much on the minds of his advisors. So I don't know the answer. I guess I have a couple of thoughts, which is going to also sound very glib, but I don't know that whether he commutes or doesn't commute is going to be his biggest problem should he choose to take the national stage. I think the fact that he's the governor of California and everything associated with that, including the current crisis that we face, with the flood of National Guard and military in the state of California to, quote, deal with immigration. So I think I find myself stumbling because I guess the way I would put it is, I think the governor's got to decide where he stands fundamentally. And I think this is all of a piece. I think taking the position he seems to be taking about the unacceptability of federal troops in the state of California to quash the First Amendment, to disallow the protection of people who are present in our borders, is very much related to taking a position on universal clemency. To me, they are part of the same piece. And I suspect that I hope he sees them as morally related, but I imagine this is part of a bigger decision about whether or not, he makes the kinds of compromises certain political advisors tell him he must make in order to be a viable candidate, or whether he wants to be the candidate who's true to the things he has always stood for. And let me say to that point, maybe I'm finally finding my voice on this issue, but he has always been opposed to the death penalty. He made that very clear in 2019. So I think in a way it would be very incongruous for him not to follow through by granting universal clemency. In many ways, I would see it as a repudiation of a very fundamental value that he's always championed.
Thank you. And before we move on, I just would like to say to Trey, we've gotten 2 messages. So I think that this is worth looking at. I think the chat is disabled for everyone who is not a presenter. Can you look into that? We do have a couple more questions, so there's time. But Trey, if you would look into that, we'd appreciate it.
Will do.
The next question is, universal clemency and abolition don't necessarily go hand in hand, do they? Governors can grant universal clemency, but they don't have the authority to abolish the death penalty. Prosecutors are still pursuing death sentences in a few counties. if Governor Newsom grants universal clemency, how would it affect those sentenced to death after it was granted? Would we start all over with a new population of death sentence people?
So also a several part question. Yes, the answer to the question about the difference in the governor's power is yes, there's a huge difference, and particularly in California. In California, the death penalty is instantiated in the state constitution, which means that the only way to actually repeal it is by electoral vote, which we have tried to do and tried to do unsuccessfully, although came very close in 2012 and 2016. So a lot of people are misinformed and think California doesn't have the death penalty anymore because of the act of the governor. Governor Newsom declared a moratorium, which means, as he said, no executions on his watch during his tenure. When he leaves office, however, whether the moratorium continues or not, whether no executions becomes, again, the watchword of the day will depend on the next governor. So yes, indeed, district attorneys in each of the 58 counties have the discretion to pursue death penalty charges and prosecutions. And there are death penalty judgments that are being imposed and have been imposed. The numbers are small. It's basically 3 or 4 a year. They come from a tiny number of counties. Riverside is probably at the top of the list. They tend to come from counties like Riverside and San Bernardino, sometimes Orange County, sometimes Los Angeles, but a very small number of counties. So those individuals are not governed, to be redundant, won't be governed by the moratorium, they're governed, by the moratorium. They cannot be executed, but they will not be impacted by universal clemency if it occurs after Governor Newsom leaves office. But we will then be faced with a very, very small death row. We will then be in a different universe, and it may be that the people of this state will be willing to take another look at the death penalty. Remains to be seen.
Thank you. I mean, I think that that's an important distinction, and thank you for the clarity in the answer. Why do we need universal clemency? Most, if not all, of the serious candidates for governor in 2026 will continue the moratorium. So thinks the person who asked this question, on executions if elected. Why doesn't that serve the purpose?
The answer I think is it depends on what is the purpose. And if the purpose is simply to forestall executions, a moratorium by the next governor will forestall executions, but it will perpetuate the status quo for everyone on death row and everyone added to death row, small numbers though they may be, during the next governor's term. And so all of the to use the word problems, I would say is an understatement, that I identified earlier when I was speaking, continue. We continue to have half of the people on death row without counsel to represent them in these important legal proceedings to challenge their death sentence. We continue to have inequity in the, perhaps most importantly, at the top of the list, the gross, egregious, persistent inequity in the imposition of the death penalty by race will be perpetuated. So one thing that the governor can at least end is that injustice. Whether some of the underlying inequities in convictions can be addressed through legal and other proceedings remains to be seen, but that can be addressed, that can be ended. So, and again, I think it goes back to what I said about what is it that the governor expressed when he declared the moratorium. What is it he believes in when he declared the moratorium? And what he said he believes in is ending this to the extent he has the power to do so. And that is the power of universal clemency.
Thank you, Liz. We have time for just one question, and I think that this is a significant question. President, you referenced it earlier in your presentation. President Biden commuted most of the federal death sentences. Have governors in other states granted universal clemency? What was the reaction in those states, and what is likely to be the reaction here in California, if you could look into a crystal ball?
So I mentioned in my presentation a number of governors who granted universal clemency. In some instances in '86 with Tony Anaya in New Mexico, it was really during a period when the popularity, to use that term, of the death penalty was on the upswing, but he did it as he was leaving office. It's been done in Maryland. It's been done in Oregon. I mentioned Governor Brown. It's not, it hasn't been done. It's been done obviously in a minority of states, but it isn't anomalous by any stretch of the imagination. And the reaction, I think, has been very dependent on the state in which it has happened and the political climate. I mean, we know in California, worst case, this is a state that is evenly divided, although slightly in favor, somewhat in favor of abolition. So I think it's fair to say that at least half of the population, perhaps more, would be in favor of the governor's action. And I think it's hard to know because we are in such a, if we were in a different time in terms of the administration of the United States government, I might have a different sense of what the reaction would be and how polarized the state is as compared to how it may be now. But I think that those who recognize what the governor is doing in this moment to speak up for the values, and you mentioned them, Michael, in the beginning, the values that we in California hold very dear. And just today, we have the revelation that the president is trying to stop California from doing the best it can to address climate change. Think of that as a moral issue as well as a political one. So to the extent that Californians recognize that we have an important identity, that is an identity that is about humanity, human decency, human dignity, I am optimistic that most Californians will view this as an action that we ought to applaud.
And while we're applauding, let us applaud you and let us applaud Vanessa, because what you've done here is consequential. We started this presentation out saying that with just 18 months remaining in his term, a powerful coalition of faith leaders, civil rights advocates, and legal experts is urging him to take the next historic step, granting universal clemency to all individuals on death row. This is a timely and it's an urgent conversation. When Robert Bacon contacted me, we were trying to figure out how we could get faith leaders to sign on. And here, just in our DNA, and in our mission is to help build understanding. That's one of the tenets in our mission statement, that today we were able to get both the spiritual, the moral, and the theological from Vanessa, and this very, very comprehensive presentation by you, Liz. And so by giving this information to those the 5,600 e-subscribers who will receive this by day's end with all of your links and the like, we hope that also including that link to give an option and an opportunity for faith leaders to sign on will have a bigger impact than have we just kind of willy-nilly tried to get that out. That's what the purpose of this was today. And so thank you for helping our faith community and our faith leaders make an informed judgment. And so,
yes,
amen.
My pleasure.
So we thank our presenters, and we thank all of you who were with us today and those who will watch the recording link. Although summer is coming upon us, it's a busy season on so many fronts, and so plan to see more special briefings like this on issues that are germane to the day. Thank you all, and God bless you and God keep you.